In the late 1800s, when America still limped on the wounds of its Civil War, the hills of Kentucky hid a secret the world wasn't ready to face. The fog that rolled through the valleys near Breathitt County wasn't just mist, it was memory, clinging to the soil like something that refused to be buried. And at the center of that fog stood Pinecroft Asylum for the Incurable, a building that, at first glance, looked more like a countryside manor than a house of suffering. Its walls were whitewashed, its gardens meticulously tended. Birds still sang in the trees around it, but no one from the nearby towns dared to linger after sunset. To the desperate and the dying, Pinecroft was a sanctuary, a place where the hopeless could meet their end in comfort. But to those who lived close enough to hear the faint cries drifting on the wind at night, it was something else entirely, a place where death itself hesitated. The asylum's founder, Dr. Isaac Schwarz, was a name whispered with awe and unease. A decorated Union surgeon turned philanthropist, Schwarz was said to have witnessed so much carnage during the war that he swore to wage a personal crusade against death. He built Pinecroft not for fame, but for redemption, or so he claimed. His portrait hung in the asylum's foyer, stern eyes, silver-framed glasses, the faintest trace of a smile that never reached his gaze. Visitors said that smile followed them down the hall. Schwarz promised peace, healing, salvation through science. And at first, that promise seemed real. Patients too far gone for any city hospital, men with consumption, women with cancers, soldiers broken by trauma, were sent to Pinecroft. Most never came back. But then came the whispers. A man declared dead from tuberculosis was found breathing again 3 days later. A woman whose body had grown cold from fever awoke in the morgue, pale but alive. By the end of that year, 73 patients had been pronounced dead and then returned. It was hailed as a miracle. Newspapers called Schwarz the man who outsmarted death. Church leaders sent letters asking for his secrets. But not everyone celebrated. The people of Breathitt County, miners, farmers, mountain folk, had a saying, "If God closes a door, you don't pry it back open." And to them, Pinecroft wasn't holy ground. It was a gatehouse to something unspeakable. At night, some claimed to see candlelight flickering behind boarded windows. Others heard low music drifting from the basement, soft, rhythmic, like a lullaby for the dead. Dogs wouldn't go near the property. Birds never nested on its roof. Still, patients kept coming. Still, Schwarz welcomed them with his quiet smile. And with each new arrival, the legend of Pinecroft Asylum grew, a place that did not cure the sick, but refused to let the dead rest. Before Pinecroft became a legend whispered in fear, it began with a man haunted by ghosts he couldn't forget. Dr. Isaac Schwarz was once hailed as a hero, a battlefield surgeon who saved lives amid the chaos of the American Civil War. But heroism has a cruel way of curdling into obsession when a man sees too much death. Imagine it, tents lined with the groans of dying soldiers, the air thick with iron and smoke, blood soaking the soil faster than he could stitch it closed. Day after day, Schwarz held life in his hands, only to watch it slip away like water through his fingers. They said he stopped praying after the Battle of Antietam. One nurse wrote that he stared at the corpses of young men as though studying them, not mourning, but calculating. When the war ended, most doctors returned home to heal the living. Schwarz turned his gaze toward the dead. He traveled across the country, New York, Philadelphia, even London, studying anatomy, embalming, and the new science of resuscitation. To his colleagues, he was brilliant but unnerving. He spoke not of curing illness, but of undoing death itself. One surgeon later recalled, he said death was not an end, only a process. A process that could, with precision, be reversed. With inherited wealth and a war pension, Schwarz built Pinecroft Asylum in the secluded hills of Kentucky, far from prying eyes. He called it a sanctuary for the incurable, a temple of mercy. But to those who knew him well, it was a laboratory, one fueled not by compassion, but by a gnawing need to prove he could conquer what had humiliated him in the war. His private notes, found years later, revealed the first cracks in his soul. He wrote of God with both reverence and resentment, describing death as a flaw in creation, a design imperfection I must correct. To him, every patient was both a person and an opportunity, a chance to test his evolving theories of reanimation. He began experimenting with methods that were decades ahead of his time, cooling the body to near freezing to slow decay, injecting unknown compounds to stimulate dormant tissue, measuring faint electrical currents in the heart after death. His assistants whispered that he rarely slept. He would wander the corridors at night, whispering to himself, "There is no death, only interruption." The more lives he failed to save, the more desperate he became. To the grieving families who came seeking comfort, he offered a saint's compassion. But behind closed doors, he was dissecting the line between body and soul, and starting to believe the soul might not matter at all. By the time the first miracle occurred, Schwarz was no longer just a doctor. He was a man possessed by a single, blasphemous conviction. If God had created life, then perhaps man could perfect it. At first, no one outside Breathitt County cared about Pinecroft. It was too far, too quiet, a place people whispered about only when someone's sickness grew too heavy to bear. But everything changed the day a man named Samuel Rourke came back from the dead. Rourke was a farmer, gaunt and coughing blood from advanced tuberculosis. When he arrived at Pinecroft, even the nurses pitied him. He could barely stand. Dr. Schwarz took him in, claiming he had a new method of restorative sedation. The next morning, Rourke was gone. Pronounced dead. A death certificate signed. His body laid in the cold room. But 3 days later, a nurse fetching linens heard a noise, faint, rasping. She opened the door and dropped her lamp. Samuel Rourke was sitting upright, eyes open, shivering, breathing. When Schwarz announced the recovery, he called it a medical anomaly, nothing more. But then it happened again, and again. A woman with stomach cancer. A young soldier racked by fever. Patients who had been declared dead were waking days later, confused, pale, but alive. By the end of 2 years, the count reached 73. 73 people who had crossed the boundary and come back. The press went wild. The Louisville Herald published a front-page article calling Dr. Isaac Schwarz the miracle healer of Kentucky. Families began sending telegrams, begging him to take their dying loved ones. The church called it divine intervention. And Schwarz? He simply smiled and said, "There are forces in nature we are only beginning to understand." But not everyone believed. The locals, the people who heard the moans at night and saw strange lights flickering from the basement, started avoiding the asylum altogether. They said the ones who returned weren't the same. That their eyes looked empty, their smiles rehearsed, their voices hollow. One local hunter swore he heard something that sounded like a woman crying from the woods, until the cry turned into a laugh, slow and mechanical. Still, the world wanted to believe in miracles. Hope is louder than fear, until fear starts to show its teeth. One evening, Schwarz hosted a banquet for donors and journalists. He stood at the head of the long oak table, wine in hand, declaring, "Gentlemen, death is merely a door, and I have found the key." The room erupted in applause. But those who looked closely swore there was something off about the servants moving among them, stiff in posture, faces expressionless, eyes not quite focused on the living. By the time the night ended, Pinecroft wasn't just a hospital. It was legend, a place where life could be restarted, remade. But as the bodies kept returning and the miracles multiplied, one terrifying question hung in the air. If these people were truly alive again, then what exactly had come back? Behind the grand facade of Pinecroft, behind the spotless corridors and perfumed wards that visitors were allowed to see, there was another wing, one that never appeared on any tour. A long, windowless corridor known among the staff as the Lazarus Ward. It was where the resurrected patients were taken after their miraculous returns. Officially, it was a recovery unit, a place for them to rest and regain strength. But those who worked there whispered a different name, the Quiet Hall. The silence was the first thing anyone noticed. No laughter. No conversation. No cries of pain. Only the soft shuffle of footsteps on polished floors and the rhythmic ticking of wall clocks. The patients, the Lazaruses as the nurses called them, sat motionless for hours, eyes open but unfocused, as if watching something no one else could see. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They didn't eat unless instructed. They didn't dream. And when night fell, their collective breathing filled the halls like the whisper of wind through an empty chapel. One nurse, Agnes Miller, left a letter to her sister that was later found decades after the asylum burned. In it, she wrote, "I saw Thomas today. His body is alive, but his soul is gone. He looks through me as if I were a shadow. Whatever the doctor brought back, it is not my brother. There were others like Thomas. Dozens. Sitting, standing, pacing, their movements eerily synchronized, like a choir that had forgotten its song but still remembered the rhythm. Dr. Schwarz dismissed these observations as temporary melancholia, claiming the near-death experience shocked the nervous system. "Their memories will return," he said with that same calm smile. But they never did. None of them remembered their names, their families, their lives before Pinecroft. It was as if they had been erased and rewritten, but the ink never dried. Some of the orderlies began quitting without notice. Others refused to work the night shifts. One, a man named Clarence Doole, was found drunk in a tavern babbling about the smell from the basement and the doctor's music for the sleepers. 2 days later, Clarence's body was found face down in a creek. Officially, an accident. Unofficially, a warning. Locals claimed they could sometimes hear faint melodies drifting from the asylum on still nights, slow, mournful violin music. No one could say where it came from or who played it, but they swore the sound carried the rhythm of human breath. In, out, perfectly timed, perfectly inhuman. Whatever was happening inside the Lazarus Ward, it wasn't healing. It was something colder, quieter, and far more calculated. And as the number of miracles grew, so did the unease. Because if the body could be revived without the soul, what else could be taken away or replaced? By 1878, Pinecroft Asylum had become both a sanctuary and a curse word in the same breath. Families from across the country wrote letters begging Dr. Schwarz to take their dying loved ones, while the people of Breathitt County stopped walking near the hill entirely. They said the air around the asylum was wrong, that it tasted of rust and rain, even on clear days. And the voices. Always the voices. At first, they were faint, murmurs on the wind, like the echo of prayers whispered underground. But then the story spread, hunters hearing low chants at midnight, travelers spotting pale figures wandering near the tree line, and farmers swearing they saw candlelight moving in the woods, not flickering, but drifting, as if carried by invisible hands. Locals started locking their doors before sunset. Even the sheriff stopped answering calls from that side of the valley. The only people who went in and out of Pinecroft anymore were the doctor's chosen staff, and even they were changing. The nurses' faces grew pale, hollow-eyed, their speech mechanical, as if rehearsed. Those who left never returned to town. Those who stayed seemed less human with each passing week. One young nurse, Emma Hodge, told a local preacher that she couldn't sleep. She said she kept hearing a hum beneath the floorboards, like machinery breathing. The preacher dismissed her fears, saying grief had gotten to her. A month later, she vanished. Her resignation letter arrived by post, written in perfect penmanship but signed in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. Rumors turned into folklore. People claimed the hill itself was cursed, that the soil rejected its dead. The name Pinecroft was slowly replaced with a darker title, The House That Defied God. Inside the asylum, Schwarz ignored the fear. His demeanor never changed, calm, charming, confident. He invited a few skeptical doctors from Cincinnati to witness his reanimations, but only one ever showed up. The man left before sunrise, pale as parchment, refusing to speak a word of what he'd seen. And still, Schwarz's work continued. Night after night, the music returned, faint violin notes from the basement, steady and cold, like a lullaby written for machines. The staff called it the doctor's midnight ritual. Meanwhile, the townspeople began finding small graves behind the asylum's iron fence, unmarked, shallow, and freshly dug. When questioned, Schwarz claimed they were failed cases, bodies beyond salvation. But the unearthed coffins told another story. The bodies inside weren't decomposing. Their faces looked peaceful, as if asleep. One local newspaper dared to ask the question everyone was afraid to voice. Are Pinecroft's miracles worth the price of their souls? And though the article was quickly buried, one curious young journalist from Louisville clipped it and kept it in his desk drawer. His name was Alfred Harrington, and soon he would be the first man in Kentucky brave enough to walk through Pinecroft's gates, not as a patient, but as a witness. Every legend needs a skeptic. And in the winter of 1879, that skeptic arrived in Breathitt County with a notebook, a revolver, and a stubborn disregard for fear. His name was Alfred Harrington, a 29-year-old reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal, known for his relentless pursuit of the truth, and his tendency to dig where others dared not look. Harrington had heard the whispers long before he set foot in Kentucky. A friend in the state archives had shown him a series of inconsistencies in Pinecroft's records. Patients declared dead, only to be quietly removed from the registry days later. No burial certificates. No follow-ups. Just vanishing. To Alfred, it smelled like either genius or madness. Either way, it was news. He arrived in the town of Jackson under an alias, posing as a writer collecting Appalachian ghost stories. It was a clever disguise. The locals were far more willing to share legends than to talk about the asylum directly. He spent nights in taverns, listening more than speaking, trading whiskey for whispers. And what he gathered was far more disturbing than any folklore. A former stable hand spoke of men who walked but didn't breathe right. A shopkeeper claimed one of the asylum's nurses had shown up at his store, bought candles, and left without blinking once during the entire transaction. And then there was Emma Hodge, the missing nurse. Rumor had it she'd fled Pinecroft and was living alone in the woods outside town, half-crazed and terrified. Alfred found her after 3 days of searching. She was pale, trembling, her cottage lit only by a single candle. At first, she refused to speak. Then, slowly, the words spilled out. She told him about the Lazarus Ward. About the patients who sat motionless for hours, eyes glazed, waiting for the next instruction. About the smell that lingered from the basement, not decay, but chemicals. And about Dr. Schwartz's secret journal, the progression ledger, she called it. He writes everything down, she whispered. Every dose, every failure, every death. That was all Alfred needed to hear. Within days, he forged papers claiming to be the relative of a wealthy Boston patient and requested a private tour of the asylum. Schwarz accepted immediately, a man always eager to impress. When Alfred first met him, he was struck by the doctor's composure. Polite, articulate, magnetic, the kind of man who could convince you gravity was optional if he said it with enough confidence. The tour was routine, too routine. White halls, calm patients, smiling nurses. But Alfred's reporter instincts screamed that it was staged. The silence felt rehearsed. And then, as they passed a locked iron door, Alfred heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, a low hum like a heartbeat under the floor. Schwarz noticed his glance and smiled. "Some doors," he said softly, "are meant to stay closed." But Alfred Harrington had never been good at following orders. And that night, he decided he would find a way to open that door, even if it killed him. The storm rolled in without warning that night, thunder shaking the hills, wind clawing at Pinecroft's windows. To anyone looking from the outside, the asylum appeared asleep, every light extinguished. But in one small upstairs room, a dim lantern flickered as Alfred Harrington prepared to cross a line he couldn't uncross. He'd watched Schwartz's routine carefully all day, when he left his office, when the orderlies made their rounds, when the nurses took their breaks. And when the clock struck midnight, Alfred moved. Lockpicks in one pocket, a notebook in the other, courage thin as paper. The corridors were silent except for the occasional rattle of the storm. He reached Schwartz's office and knelt by the door. The lock was intricate but old. 2 minutes, one quiet click, and the door creaked open. The air inside was sterile, too clean. The scent of chemicals and leather clung to everything. On the mahogany desk lay a single black volume, thick and heavy, bound in cracked leather. The words engraved on its cover read, "Progression Ledger." Harrington's pulse pounded as he opened it. What he found inside wasn't madness, it was worse. It was method. Each page was filled with precise notes, elegant handwriting cataloging experiments in clinical detail. Subject 12. Terminal consumption. Suspension. 72 hours. Revival successful. Personality erased. Subject 47. Acute melancholia. Response to reanimation optimal. Memory absent. Will minimal. Designation compliant. He read on, horror mounting. The miracles weren't resurrections. They were simulations of death, induced by a chemical compound Schwarz had created from a rare Appalachian flower he called Morpheus Toxin. It slowed the body's functions to near nothing, heartbeat once per minute, breath nearly imperceptible. To the human eye, the patient appeared dead. After several days in this false death, Schwarz would inject the antidote, violently restarting the body. But the process did more than revive. It rewired. It stripped away memories, emotions, even individuality, leaving behind a living shell. Schwarz's words on the next page froze Alfred's blood. The soul is inefficient. Emotion breeds chaos. In death's shadow, I have found the path to purity. He wasn't curing disease. He was erasing humanity itself. Page after page detailed the successes. Schwarz spoke of them like creations, not patients. He wrote of Phase 2, narrative implantation, where hypnosis and suggestion would overwrite erased minds with new personalities, obedient, functional, perfect. Alfred's hands shook as thunder cracked outside. He snapped photographs of the pages, scribbled notes, ready to flee, but then a sound made him freeze. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Right outside the door. He snuffed the lantern and pressed himself against the wall. The doorknob turned. Through the darkness, the faint glow of a match flared, and there stood Dr. Isaac Schwarz, calm as ever, holding a syringe filled with something black and glistening. "Mr. Harrington," he said, voice smooth and cold, "I see you've found my work." He stepped closer. "Tell me, would you like to see how it feels to be reborn?" For a moment, time froze. Alfred stood motionless, his heart hammering against his ribs as Dr. Isaac Schwarz advanced with the syringe glinting in the lantern light. The doctor's face wasn't angry, it was curious, like a man studying a rare insect before pinning it to glass. "Don't struggle, my boy," Schwarz said softly. "Think of it as a contribution to the future." Behind him, two orderlies emerged from the shadows, the same hollow-eyed attendants Alfred had seen earlier, moving like puppets on invisible strings. Alfred's mind raced. There was no way out, only one window, two guards, and a locked door between him and the storm outside. He clutched the ledger to his chest, his only proof, his only weapon. As Schwarz reached for his arm, Alfred did the only thing instinct could conjure. He kicked over the kerosene lamp. The world erupted. The lamp shattered against the floorboards, and fire leapt like a living thing. Flames crawled up the curtains, swallowing the air in a roar. Schwarz staggered back, shielding his face, while the orderlies froze in confusion, uncertain, unthinking. Alfred seized the moment. He lunged for the window, smashing it with his shoulder. Shards tore into his arm, but adrenaline drowned out the pain. Behind him, he heard Schwarz shouting, not in fear, but in fury. "Stop him! He carries the future!" Alfred dove through the window, crashing into a hedge below. The impact knocked the breath from his lungs, but the rain outside hissed against the spreading blaze like a divine intervention. He scrambled to his feet, limping, clutching the black ledger to his chest. Behind him, Pinecroft glowed like a beacon of damnation, fire curling through its windows, screams echoing in the wind, human and not quite human. Through the chaos, he heard the faintest sound, violin music. The same melody the nurses said played at night. It drifted from the burning building, slow and haunting, as if the asylum itself were singing its own requiem. He ran. Through the forest, through mud and darkness, branches clawing at his clothes. Behind him, he could hear them, voices calling, distorted and wrong, as if spoken through cracked throats. The orderlies were following, their lanterns cutting through the trees like floating eyes. He pushed himself harder, pain searing through his leg. Every step felt like a lifetime. He slipped into a creek, the cold water numbing his skin, the ledger still clutched tight in his arms. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It didn't matter. Somewhere in that endless black forest, Alfred collapsed on a dirt road, gasping, trembling, soaked to the bone. A light approached, a lantern, then two, then a dozen. He raised his hand weakly. "Help!" he croaked. "Pinecroft! The patients!" The figures stopped. A familiar voice called out, "Sheriff's office! Stay still!" Relief flooded through him. He had made it. As he was lifted into the wagon, he clutched the ledger one last time, whispering through cracked lips. He wasn't saving them, he was erasing them. And somewhere behind him, in the burning ruins of Pinecroft, Dr. Isaac Schwarz simply vanished. Dawn broke over Breathitt County like a wounded sun. Smoke still curled over the hills where Pinecroft Asylum once stood, black against a bruised sky. Word of the fire spread fast, carried by terrified whispers through the town of Jackson. By mid-morning, Sheriff Collier and his men were already on their way up the winding road toward the asylum, rifles in hand and faces pale with unease. In the back of the wagon, Alfred Harrington lay wrapped in a blanket, shivering, clutching the soot-stained ledger to his chest. His voice was hoarse from smoke, his eyes bloodshot. But when the sheriff asked what had happened, he spoke with quiet certainty. "He wasn't curing them, Sheriff. He was building them." At first, Collier didn't believe it. But the moment his deputies kicked open the asylum's main doors, all skepticism died. The interior was a cathedral of horror. The fire had spared much of the basement, and what they found there would haunt Kentucky for generations. Rows of beds lined the underground hall, each occupied by a silent, motionless patient. Their chests rose and fell in eerie unison, their eyes glassy and vacant. Some were hooked to strange tubes. Others simply sat upright, awake but unreachable. When one deputy tried to speak to a woman, she only blinked once and whispered, "I'm waiting for the doctor." Further inside, they found the laboratory, a chamber of glass and metal. Vials labeled Morpheus compound. A notebook describing stages of purification. And a second book, unfinished, its final entry written in a trembling hand. Phase 2. Narrative implantation successful. The new man will not remember his past. But of Dr. Isaac Schwarz, there was no trace. No body. No footprints leading away. Just his cane, half-charred, lying beside a shattered vial of the Morpheus Toxin. The sheriff ordered the patients moved to nearby hospitals, but most never recovered. They remained docile, silent, human bodies without the spark that made them alive. State authorities arrived within days, sealing the site, confiscating every document, and silencing anyone who'd seen too much. The official report reduced everything to unethical medical experimentation. The truth, the resurrection, the erased minds, the chemical death, was buried under bureaucratic ink. Alfred Harrington's story ran in the Courier-Journal, but only a fraction of what he wrote ever made it to print. His editors called it sensationalism. The rest, his notes, his photographs, the ledger itself, were seized and filed under state evidence, never to be seen again. Still, the legend of Pinecroft refused to die. Locals claimed they saw a figure in black wandering the woods weeks after the fire, tall, thin, walking with a limp. Some said it was Schwarz, escaped, still searching for subjects. Others swore it was one of his creations, a man reborn but forever empty. And so, the case was closed. No trial. No closure. Just 73 breathing reminders that some things are worse than death, and one missing doctor who proved it. The official record ends in 1881. The fires burned out, the reports were sealed, and Pinecroft Asylum was left to rot in silence. But legends, especially the dark ones, have a way of surviving the truth. For decades, no one dared to rebuild on that land. The soil was said to be sterile, the grass refusing to grow. Locals claimed they could still hear faint humming beneath the ground on quiet nights, a mechanical breath, slow and rhythmic, like the remnants of some buried heartbeat. Children were warned never to wander near the ruins. And those who did returned pale, silent, and unwilling to say what they'd seen. As the years passed, Pinecroft faded into folklore. It became a ghost story, told by candlelight, the tale of the doctor who cheated death and paid the price. But somewhere in the state archives of Kentucky, sealed behind dust and red tape, fragments of the truth remain. Handwritten pages from Alfred Harrington's notes. A few brittle newspaper clippings. A photograph of a black leather-bound ledger that has never been found again. Even now, historians argue whether the Morpheus toxin ever truly existed. Some claim it was an early form of anesthesia gone wrong. Others insist it was something far beyond science, a compound that blurred the line between life and oblivion. But those who've studied the case agree on one thing. The patients were changed. Not healed, not revived, reprogrammed. A few descendants of Pinecroft's staff claim to have inherited unusual documents, coded formulas, sketches of chemical structures, even diagrams labeled Phase 3. If those papers were real, then Schwartz's disappearance wasn't an ending. It was a relocation. One letter, unearthed from a Louisville attic in 1924, still chills researchers today. Written in immaculate handwriting and signed only with the initials I.S., it reads. The error was not in the formula, but in the vessel. The human mind resists perfection. The next iteration will correct that. No one knows if it was genuine. But if it was, it means Dr. Isaac Schwarz survived the fire and continued his work elsewhere. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Pinecroft. Not the building, not the 73 bodies, not even the ledger. But the idea that death, that most sacred boundary, can be tampered with by human hands. That somewhere, someone may still be perfecting the art of resurrection, without the need for a soul. Even today, hikers in the Kentucky hills swear they've seen strange lights where Pinecroft once stood, a single flicker of candlelight moving steadily through the trees. And if you listen closely, some say, you can still hear that faint, haunting violin playing from beneath the earth. Maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's memory. Or maybe Dr. Schwarz never stopped playing his song. Clapperboard outro. Optional voiceover ending. What do you think? Was Pinecroft a miracle of science, or humanity's first step toward something far darker? Tell me your theory in the comments below. And if you survived this deep dive into the archives of fear, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so together we keep these forgotten stories alive. Even if some are better left buried.